Okay, so deniable possibility raising can be harmful. It's also common and relatable and relatively easily substantiated. So unlike some of the kinds of denial that we like to do with implicatures and with other ways of conveying content, deniable possibility raising, I think, is so widespread and so easy to relate to that as a type, even if not all tokens are like this, as a type, it needn't target someone's intentions, right? It can be something that as a result needn't, although sometimes it will, but needn't make someone or their advocates defensive. Because you're not really talking about the character of the person who does deniable possibility raising, at least not in all cases. You're not really talking about their intentions. And so you're not involved in blame in the same way that you might be with other ways of putting content out there. And then finally, I think a really interesting feature of deniable possibility raising is that it's easy to rectify compared to lots of other ways of getting content out, because all you have to do is deny the possibility, right? So the speaker can just say not P after the fact, or a bystander can say not P after the fact, and do that in a very direct way if that's kind of what's called for, or do it in a way that maybe is a little more indirect, that involves calling someone in, or you know, saying, well, of course we all agree that, and denying a possibility via entailments of a conciliatory speech act like that. Okay, now I want to look at some theoretical features of deniable possibility raising. As I just suggested, speaker intentions don't seem to constrain it. So it's very easy to raise a possibility in this way, regardless of your intentions. We're all familiar with doing that through ambiguity, and it can, you know, you can proliferate examples if you start to think about all the different places this comes up. It's also very easy for deniable possibility raising to occur. And then two theoretical features that I want to spend a bit of time on. The force of deniable possibility raising is very weak. In fact, I think it's weaker than the force associated with epistemic possibility, weaker than might claims, weaker than perhaps and maybe claims. And finally, the possibility that phi can be deniably raised without it becoming presupposed that it might be that phi. So these 2 points kind of go together, and I want to spend some time talking about them now. First, I'm going to talk about the weakness point. So compare 5 prime to 7. 5 prime, when your opponent is on his knees, you drive him to the ground and choke him out. What Cotton actually said, if they're on their knees and surrender, then you accept their surrender. So he raises the possibility, he denies it. Compare that to raising the possibility via an epistemic modal, and I think you get anomaly. It might be that when your opponent is on their knees and surrender, you should drive them to the ground and choke them out. If they're on their knees and surrender, then you accept their surrender. So this sounds like, you know, some kind of incoherence, right? There's some kind of contradictory force there. So that suggests that the force of deniable possibility raising is weaker than might, perhaps, and so on. That's not to say that every time we have something like deniable possibility raising, we get something that's weaker than that force, but just that as a type, we need to accommodate this capacity for it to be weaker than epistemic possibility claims. Okay, now the fourth theoretical feature, the possibility that phi can be deniably raised without it becoming presupposed that might phi. So giving probably too much credit to Cotton, suppose he didn't realize that what he said raised the possibility that when your opponent is on their knees and surrender, you should drive them to the ground and choke them out. Nevertheless, that possibility could be raised for other discourse participants. So he, not knowing, hypothetically, that that possibility was raised, suffices to prevent it from being any kind of common ground, nevertheless, the possibility could be raised for others. So we shouldn't think that we can exhaust a theory of deniable possibility raising by looking at an analogy to Mike claims or by looking at what becomes presupposed. So that leaves us with a puzzle. What is the force of deniable possibility raising? I've suggested that, well, obviously, like the force of phi is generally weaker than the force of might phi. And I've tried to argue that the force of deniable possibility raising in general is weaker than the force of might phi. So where does that leave us with respect to this extremely weak force? And nevertheless harmful force. That's part of why I'm interested in it. Okay, well, I want to try to preface my answer with a sketch of a couple of methodological commitments. One is that I think it's important to pay a lot of attention to the particular people who are involved in a speech situation when you're thinking, I think this about pragmatics in general, but I think it's especially important here. And it's especially important here to pay special attention to how uses of language can reverberate into the future. So I think it's important to not try to abstract away too much from the actual participants in a speech situation when we want to think about the force of deniable possibility raising. And secondly, I am really attracted to a view about pragmatics that downplays the importance of kind of theoretical predictions that a phenomenon will occur, and instead tries to highlight the importance of first drawing out similarities and contrasts between a case at issue and a relevant range of alternative cases. And second, trying first to recognize an instance of a pragmatic phenomenon like implicature, and then to try to give explanations of it that elucidate what's going on, that help us understand what's going on, that help us see how it's possible for the implicature to work, as opposed to giving some kind of gnomic explanation. You know, here are the maxims that are triggered or something like that, and here's the content that we should expect as a result. I think it's attractive for lots of cases to say, no, here's the implicature, we identified it, and then to try to explain how it's possible for that implicature to occur. So you could be skeptical here. You could say that our theoretical goals are going to be you know, kind of undercut by that commitment to particularism, that skepticism about the role that kind of broad pragmatic principles are going to play. But I think that that's premature. I think that finding ways to categorize pragmatic phenomena can help us draw analogies and contrasts between cases. And applying those categorizations can improve awareness of ethically important aspects of language. So we don't want to put the systematizing, generalizing, abstracting cart before the horse. Sometimes it's important to see there's something here that we need to start paying attention to. We need to start thinking about. We need to start talking to others about before the theoretical work that others, honestly, probably not me, but others might be interested in doing on it. So I want to try to, you know, talk about the theoretical goals here, given that you're a particularist. I'm not going to try to persuade you to be a particularist, but explain that that's part of why I'm not trying to give a theory that predicts exactly when there'll be deniable possibility raising. Instead, I think we recognize it, and then we want to kind of describe it well, describe it in an illuminating way that helps us draw connections to other phenomena. Okay, so in that descriptive vein, we can ask what's the force of deniable possibility raising? And I want to give some tentative answers. First, I want to make clear that I'm focusing on discourse dynamics here. I'm not thinking about how the individuals in the discourse are affected so much as the kind of communicative effect, right? So there might be interesting work to do in formal epistemology on exactly what it is for a possibility to be raised for someone. but I'm going to leave that aside for now. And then focusing on discourse dynamics, we can say in typical cases, assertions that phi make it presupposed that phi, and assertions that might phi make it not presupposed that not phi. Again, just in typical cases. And then continuing that kind of line, we could say that deniable possibility raising of phi establishes or strengthens, depending on the particular situation we're looking at, what I'm going to call an interpretive toehold. So an interpretive toehold, kind of like without loss of generality, could be an interpretive foothold for all I care. But what's distinctive about the deniable possibility raising is often, if not always, that you just get a little bit, right? You get something that allows you to justify certain interpretations to others. So the idea behind interpretive toeholds here is that you can later in conversation appeal back to the establishment or strengthening or building of an interpretive toehold to justify your interpretation in the kind of fullness of the discourse. Another way to kind of describe interpretive toeholds here would be to look at some of what I tried to do in my paper on the evolution of common ground, channels for common ground. You could say interpretive toeholds influence how subsequent discourse is likely to evolve. So they don't necessarily make one interpretation really likely to be defended or one kind of justificatory move really likely to be made, but they make that possible where earlier maybe it just wasn't, practically speaking, possible at all. Okay, so now let's look back at the applications, let's look back at the examples and talk about applications a bit. I said that if you see something, say something can raise the possibility that if you see something that would likely be handled unfairly, you should say something. I want to say about that uses of this sentence can establish an interpretive toehold to which participants can sensibly appeal in something like the following way. It follows from what the speaker said that if you see something that would likely be handled unfairly, you should say something. Similarly, I'm going to try to nap for 10 to 15 minutes, can establish an interpretive toehold to which participants can sensibly appeal. It follows from what the speaker said that for 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to try to nap. Or I'm going to try to nap for 10 to 15 minutes can also establish an interpretive toehold to which participants can sensibly appeal. It follows from what the speaker said that I'm going to try to take a nap for 10 to 15 minutes. Applying this to cotton, we get when your opponent is on his knees, you drive him to the ground and choke him out, can establish an interpretive toehold to which, again, participants can sensibly appeal. It follows from what the speaker said that if they're on their knees and surrender, you choke them out. Now, with apologies to the abusive use of this meme, which I think isn't quite idiomatic, you might ask, is this fruitful, right? Is it fruitful to theorize in terms of deniable possibility raising? What do we get out of this? And in particular, a challenge here might be, look, there are all kinds of ways to establish or strengthen interpretive toeholds. Lots of speech acts do that. So why think about deniable possibility raising at all? Well, let's go back to the practical features. As I suggested, deniable possibility raising can be harmful. It's common, relatable, and relatively easily substantiated. You can talk about it without necessarily making someone defensive. It's often relatively easily rectified with a simple denial of the relevant possibility. Interpretive toeholds really aren't like that. So of course they can be harmful, but interpretive toeholds as a class are huge. There are all different kinds of ways to make it possible for someone to justify their interpretation or make it like add to the justifiability of the interpretation. So to say, well, you know, when you said so-and-so, you established an interpretive toehold, I think isn't as helpful as to say, you raised a possibility. Similarly, Interpretive toeholds aren't, in general, as a class, relatively easy to rectify, and deniable possibilities are. So again, you could say, in response to some deniable possibility raising, look, you raised this possibility, never mind your intentions, your speech act raised the possibility, and you have a means available to you to rectify the situation. You could just assert the negation of that possibility. So in response to the worry that toeholds being such a big class, that those are the things that we really should be thinking about, I think deniable possibility raising has some really distinctive practical features that mean we should start to describe things more often in terms of it. And really emphasizing that role of rectifiability, I think, is key to seeing the utility of theorizing in terms of this. Okay, so some practical upshots. Theorizing in terms, or describing noxious speech in terms of deniable possibility raising elucidates rectifications that speakers could make. It elucidates rectifications that bystanders can make by asserting the negation of some possibility raised. It facilitates a kind of pattern recognition and rectification, because while it's really easy to raise deniable possibilities, and while we do it all the time, those who have a pattern of doing it are differently guilty than people who kind of do it by accident now and then, right? So having the conceptual framework to say, here is a pattern of deniable possibility raising on the part of this speaker, I think can be really helpful. I think that being able to think about what causes people to raise deniable possibilities and which possibilities are raised in which particular cases might illuminate some connections to ideology. And as I was suggesting earlier, I think that just having the concept can help improve awareness of ethically important aspects of language. Now, I've said a bunch of times that this is a really broad category. I want to kind of run through just briefly some other places to look to help that breadth, help make sure that that breadth is clear. So I think unclarity, ambiguity, all kinds of underspecification can lead to deniable possibility raising. You can get it about the ordering sources of modals. You can get it in what reading of a generic is relevant, is the one we should take away, is the one we should add to the common ground. Generics are often going to raise deniable possibilities with respect to exactly what underwrites the truth of the generic. Metaphors and analogies and all kinds of open textured language are going to raise deniable possibilities. Omissions, information structure, I think, can play a role in raising deniable possibilities. For example, by suggesting that something is like the most important thing to talk about or the thing that we should be talking about right now. But those possibilities are often easily and straightforwardly denied. Unclarity and quantifier domains can do it, even when modals aren't involved. Vagueness and ambiguity can do it. The relationship with ideology, as noisy and vexed as it is, I think is a key source of it. And then lots of the examples that people have talked about in the literature, I think, yeah, Jenny's here. I really want to talk to you about this, Jenny. Examples where the speaker is sometimes, engaged in something like, trying to offer a fig leaf or something like that, because they want to say, I was joking, right? Part of what I'm interested in the kind of deniability here is that, for the cases I'm after, someone can just assert the negation, right? So you could raise a possibility, someone who defends themselves could, say they were just joking and, and so that possibility wasn't really raised. Another thing that they could do would be to just assert the negation of the raised possibility. And, not in all cases, but in some cases that'll be more helpful than saying, I was just joking. Conditional antecedents that kind of undercut the assertive force of a claim. Like if I were a conspiracy theorist, I'd think that, or if I didn't know better, I'd think that. One of our epidemiologist friends just said, if I were a conspiracy theorist, I'd think that. And that's a way of like, even weaker than a might, getting a possibility raised that can nevertheless be denied. And all the Trumpian qualifications are good places to look to. Like people are saying, I keep hearing, could it be that? And I don't know, but blah, blah, blah. Okay, so yeah, some more examples like likes and retweets. These are kind of complicated, but potentially in some cases will have this property. And talking about things like allegations, talking about prior convictions can raise a possibility that someone actually committed the crime without being as strong as saying they might have committed the crime. And prior felonies is a horrible expression, but we see it. So I think that this is part of how it works. Okay, now I want to talk briefly about another practical upshot, which is that you can get like a network of interpretive toeholds. So one can add strength and plausibility to others. And that can kind of like strengthen the other interpretive toeholds, right? So you get a series or network or some kind of foundation of interpretive toeholds that can be appealed to in efforts to justify certain interpretations. And when that kind of network occurs, you can get especially harmful effects from deniable possibility raising. So here's an example I just heard this week, actually, in a really great podcast. Not to say that New Yorker Radio Hour is always a great podcast, but this one was really great. Simon Adler, reporting on the political situation in Ethiopia, described Jawar Mohammed, who's as neutrally as I can put it, an Ethiopian activist, saying things during like good kind of anti-authoritarian protests. I'm trying to be neutral here. Like, this is our land, this is our homeland. And as Adler puts it, at the time that he was saying these things, that sounded like it was identified with Ethiopians in general. And then subsequent events unfolding in Ethiopia made that line sound very different. As he puts it, went from being about Ethiopians getting a corrupt government out of power to Oromos, an Ethiopian ethnicity that's historically been oppressed, getting minorities out of their territory. So part of the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I think a huge practical upshot that, whether or not you like this talk, you should kind of try to take away, is that the reason that this that they were talking about this in this podcast is that this kind of phenomenon was challenging for the content moderation that Facebook was trying to do. Okay, so I love theoretical linguistics and pragmatics more generally as much as anybody, but identifying phenomena that are going to be challenging for content moderation is crucial for those of us who are well positioned to do that, to contribute to, because there isn't any kind of framework really to say, this is our land, this is our homeland, independently of paying attention to the actual participants and the actual speech situation that they're in. Is it or isn't hate speech, right? So people are trying to look at a sentence like this with the tools of contemporary AI, which, as impressive as they are really crude when it comes to conversational context, when it comes to who's actually saying what and who they're saying it to. And they're trying to decide whether that sentence, this is our land, this is our homeland, is or isn't hate speech. So I hope that this work kind of points in the direction of a kind of identification that might be helpful, right? At least, I mean, if not in providing work that contemporary AI could do, or even AI of the next decade could do, in providing a sense of where humans need to be involved, who have expertise on the local situations that they're talking about. Because what we have here is deniable possibility raising, right? Ambiguity with respect to the resolution of R and R in homeland. That's deniable possibility raising. Mohammed could have said, I don't mean Oromos, right? Or he could have said, not Oromo's land, not Oromo's homeland, Ethiopian land, Ethiopian homeland. He didn't deny that possibility. And the recent history in Ethiopia, you know, is tragic. Okay, so with that in the background, I want to think about, or I just want to reiterate that these practical upshots of thinking about deniable possibility raising in this way, and the broader kind of framework that I'm trying to encourage people to think about, aren't just important for 2 people talking to each other, or 3 people talking to each other, or 30 people talking to each other. They're important because at some point, big data, AI, content moderation are going to be looking not just to ethicists, but hopefully also to philosophers of language and linguists to do a better job on thinking about rectification, thinking about harm. And so I offer this as a first attempt in that direction. Thanks, Lala.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. That's great. Take home messages. In particular, it's funny because we're looking at hate speech detection with our team. But let's go to question. I see Jenny. Yes.
That was super interesting. And I have a very basic question, actually. I think I might just be being kind of thick. But it's a question about the scope of what counts as a possibility that's been deniably raised, and what determines that. So, for example, suppose somebody hears, if you see something, say something, and they say, aha, okay, I see my cup, and I see my water bottle, and I see the ceiling, and I see, it's like, no, those possibilities you want to say weren't even deniably raised, right? And I wanted to know what determines that those possibilities weren't even deniably raised, and which ones were deniably raised.
I want to know that too.
Okay.
I guess I would say, I tried to pick an example here where you could think plausibly it's raised. Like, even if it would be treated unfairly, out of an abundance of caution, right? If I see something that, I should let the authorities know. They're the people in the position to take care of it. And then I don't, how do I want to put this? I think there are going to be core cases where it's even harder to kind of like disagree or come up with a context where the possibility isn't raised. And there are going to be cases like yours that are on the other side. I don't know either whether it's right to draw the line in a particular place or to think that there's something like a continuum. But I think like as a kind of first step, I'm thinking, let's think about the paradigmatic cases where we can say that it's raised, right? So then that goes back to the particularism thought, which again is kind of putting recognition, sorry, I can't find that slide right now, but kind of putting recognition first and theorizing in an explanatory way second. So, sorry, I'm just not going to be able to find that slide. So you could say like, okay, I want to do that theorizing because I actually want to have some kind of automated content moderation. And I really worry about automated content moderation, not to say that human content moderation is fully effective or all that humane for the people who are engaged in it. But I worry about algorithmic content moderation that it can be scaled up far too quickly, far too easily, and do a lot of damage because of that. So I would want to say, look, maybe humans can develop a sensibility for when deniable possibility raising occurs and when it doesn't, right? Some of us are going to be better at that than others, and maybe we can learn how to do a good job at it. But I'm not in the business of trying to give necessary and sufficient conditions for it to occur or not.
Can I have a follow-up or not? I don't know.
Please do.
Okay, so I'm not trying to develop algorithms or anything. That's not my my thing. I'm just wondering, like, is it something about what interpretations an audience is likely to come to? Is it something about what the speaker intends? Is it something about what's culturally salient?
I see. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's the kind of question I'm asking about. What sort of thing determines it?
Okay, good. And I'm sorry about that speech. I don't think intentions are gonna be helpful for the whole class. So I think, for example, like scope ambiguity often outstrips intentions. But for all I've said here, there could be kind of terrains within the class where intentions are important. But I think kind of like tactically, it makes sense to see how much we can say that's interesting about the class as a whole, and then to try to find differences. But in a short answer, if you think that this is a natural kind, or I love David's phrase from last talk, a butterfly that you can pin down, right? If you think that this is a natural kind, then no, intentions won't be especially relevant. And I think that's part of why the denials don't have to advert to intentions. They're not like, I didn't mean to suggest, but just a negation of the possibility.
Great. So I think I was struck, but I think I saw Jason, Justin, Alex, Manfred, Christoph. So Jason.
Okay, thanks a lot for this talk. It's very interesting. I have a sort of substantive question and then a practical question about the point about like Facebook's board and things like that, which we'll all as a community really have to think about. Like, should we be on? What do we have to add? Things like that. So first of all, the phenomenon, it seems to me you were talking as if it was nefarious, but you know, if you're targeted like I am and many people here, I assume, are by campus reform or other such outlets who are screenshotting your social media all the time, you're an expert at deniable possibility raising. I mean, that's what you do on social media. You know, you want that, or you want your claim when you're giving a talk or whatever, not just social media, but also your pieces to be to raise possibilities, but not deny them in such a way that will lead to a campus reform article. And that's the whole. I
completely agree.
Yeah, that's the whole game. Or you say to your colleagues, no, I'm not calling you a racist. So that means, and that leads to the sort of question that is not really a content. It's like, what do we have to add to Facebook boards, which are being organized sort of around here? And I think they are often organized by looking at people from different parts of the world with particular content knowledge. So if deniable possibility raising are these phenomena that our toolkit will allow us to identify are sort of ethically and politically neutral, as I think is going to be the case. And so much is going to be going into the content. And this is something like I'm just kind of tormented by. Like, what specifically do we have to add? Is it going to be all content? Is it going to be all the social and political situation? If are there going to be structures here that are going to be necessary to identify for content moderation? I mean, I've been asked about people to suggest for these boards, and they're always about like, no, we need people with local knowledge. Do you know journalists in Brazil?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the board. So Facebook is talking now in kind of like transnational terms with respect to these things, and I think that's a mistake. But to go to the heart of your question, I don't think deniable possibility raising is generally harmful. It's harmful depending on the content and the circumstances. So I absolutely agree with you on that. And then the question, like, who is well suited to see it? I guess what I'm thinking is there are kind of borderline cases where you want to say, I'm thinking like, absent this kind of concept, you're thinking there's something fishy here, but I can't put my finger on what it is. So it doesn't look like dog whistling. It's not something where I can necessarily pin something to the person's intentions. Maybe they're kind of retweeting something and they're not aware of some of what's going on. Philosophers of language and linguists might be able to help with the tricky cases, but I think an additional layer of help is just to be able to say about the non-tricky cases, here's a category of discourse force that someone on the board with local knowledge might helpfully be able to appeal to in characterizing what is fishy about the thing that was said or put out there. So I think you're asking a question like maybe there's like applied philosophy of language and linguistics where an expert comes in and says, yeah, this case is like that other case for these reasons. And that could be a helpful thing to do. And then there's a slightly more theoretical thing, which is to say, here are some relevant analogies or like ways of thinking about what's relevant and what's not relevant that might help you identify cases, as opposed to just saying there's something fishy going on here.
Right. So we have Justin.
Hi, Eric. I wanted to just see what you thought of the following two sort of suggestive ways we might take your project. So one is if we could distinguish between the sort of material effects of this possible deniable possibility raising. And that could be distinguished from which possibilities are in fact raised. So it could be the case that lots of people think that this possibility is raised and that is like sufficient for, lots of practical effects, but it's not, given, whatever it takes to be, to actually be raised. And so that kind of goes to a way of reframing Jenny's question. And then the second thought I had was just that it could be that a lot of this is the product of whether something is raised in the possibly raised in the conversation might have more to do with, it might be something that's negotiable. So it's like subject to all this things that factor into negotiability, including power dynamics in the conversation and that sort of thing. And so if that's right, then one way we might end up taking your project is to say, okay, we need to look less at like, you've identified the mechanism or whatever linguistically, but now it's time for us as like philosophers of language to just like step aside and actually like cede the ground to people who actually know something about social dynamics and power structure and that sort of thing. So I was wondering what you thought of those two ways of taking your project.
Yeah, on the first thought, I think they're both great questions. I'm not so let me just say the way I was thinking of it, maybe this doesn't quite answer your question, but the way I was thinking of it, it's so easy to raise a possibility that it will not be the case that there's disagreement in the conversation about whether the possibility was raised. But I think you're probably right and I was wrong. imagine a conversation with people with very different local knowledge. One person, the possibility could be kind of raised individually for one and not for another. So I'm kind of like conceding, like, I think that's a great point. And it goes to my focus on discourse as opposed to on the individual states. And so I think part of what you're bringing out is that there's interesting work to be done, maybe not by any of us, but there's interesting work to be done in epistemology or philosophy of mind or psychology, thinking about what the individual state of having a raised possibility is, under what conditions that obtains, and how that's affected by all sorts of things. Good. And then on the second, I mean, I guess I think, so like someone comes along and says, like, here's a category, right? You weren't using this category before, but I think it'll be useful to you. And the question is to apply it to some cases first. So I think it's not like I'm sure that this category is the right category or something. I would like to be applying it to more and more cases before it got handed over anyway to social psychology. And the thought was that the philosophy of language work was done, right? Or the linguistics work was done here. In the meantime, I think it's probably useful. So I think it's helpful for thinking about content moderation and, noxious speech more broadly, but I don't think it's in a handover state yet. Is that responsive to the second question? Okay.
Super. So we have Alex. I think, Jason, you had your question. Manfred, Christoph, and Sally. So, yeah, Alex.
Yeah, thanks. So I think I was wondering, like, to what, like, if this is really a phenomenon about language or maybe something more general. I mean, because, for instance, like if I take my glass or something like that, I might raise the possibility that I now take a sip of water, or that I stand up and refill it, or whatever. Yeah. And it might just be that and you can also do that by speaking and raise certain possibilities, but it's maybe not essential, and it might shift the focus, like in terms of, maybe would shift the focus in terms of how you would approach that whole topic.
Good, yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Alex. I guess I think that the denials are weird after that. But yeah, there'll be cases where the denials are okay. That's really interesting. In some respects, I kind of like that, because I worry when I say philosophers of language and linguists should be more involved with thinking about content moderation. I worry, well, there's a lot of content that isn't our expertise, but that's, non-linguistics. But I think I can kind of take your point the other way, which is to say, look, the linguistic stuff can provide us a guide. So it might be that there is possibility raising through other media, right? And that needs to be something paid attention to as well. So I suppose I'm trying to, absorb the force of the blow and say, but doesn't that just show how much more interesting this is?
Right, Manfred is next.
Yeah, I just have a small remark. If deniable possibilities are often raised, then one should also expect that they are often denied. And I think there is some linguistic indication for that, because it seems to me that there are specialized forms or constructions that should occur quite frequently. So in English, this might be something like the not that construction. So I could say things like refugees shouldn't live in my neighborhood. Not that they shouldn't have a nice place to live, but yeah. And so this not that seems to be a kind of construction with this particular purpose. And there's something quite similar in German, which I'm more familiar with. So and the presence of such dedicated constructions might point to a frequent task in communication. I don't know whether this is plausible. I don't know.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah. So I hope, I'm not sure this is right, but I hope that that construction is not effective in general at canceling conversational implicatures, because that would help to kind of carve out this category a little bit better. And I think that that's right. I think if I say that restaurant is fine, not that it's, you know, not that it's not great, it's just not to my taste or something, that sounds a little awkward compared to, I don't mean to suggest that. Jenny just put a nice example in the chat. They got married and had children, not that it was in that order. And I don't know, it sounds a little unidiomatic to me, but Jenny, do you like that example?
It feels fine to me. I mean, I think it's more natural to say not in that order, but I think it feels totally fine to me. But I mean, that's just one person's intuitions.
Yeah. Thanks for the example.
Thanks.
I think Christoph is next, and then Sally.
Oh, it's really dark. Anyway, just a silhouette. Yeah, I was wondering. All of your examples were kind of sort of where the things that are alluded to are kind of bad, or at worst nefarious in some sense, right? Like it's with the married and children example, right? It's the thing that's being implied is something negative, and I was sort of thinking of examples where people are trying to subvert censorship in some respect. I was sort of thinking of historical examples from like communist Germany times, like East German times, where they had, obviously there was communist censorship, very strict with the Stasi and all, but the way that people would subvert that and raise criticism is by sort of adopting a very extreme version of simplistic, almost childish naivety in the way they express themselves, to be always on the safe side. So they always had plausible deniability. But obviously, it's sort of the opposite approach of all of your examples, where instead of sort of using language that could be interpreted in a negative way, the language is so positive, so naive, so childish that there's no way to sort of argue that it could be interpreted in a negative way. But still, the context in which those debates happened, it was very clear what people were hinting at. So I'm just wondering whether context shouldn't play a bigger role. And you see sort of similar strategies with like people in the alt-right. They sort of have this codified way of talking, and so you can't always turn it against them because you can never pin them down what they actually said. It's a sort of a similar strategy, avoiding censorship examples. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like these examples are a little different from Jason Stanley's earlier. So Jason's examples were like you're kind of embracing a cloud of meanings and knowing that you can deny some of them if you need to. And with these examples, if I have the right example in mind, Christoph, it's like you're saying something about our dear leader, and you know,
exactly something like that, but you're actually making fun of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like sarcasm via overstatement or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sort of there's like a recent Chinese example, you know, the Winnie the Pooh thing.
Yeah.
You know, like sort of like something that is so childish and ridiculous. But it's not quite. It's you can't actually pin these people down and say, oh, you're just mocking them. But it's just one step short of mockery. But it's very childish, very simplistic, and at the same time, these people raising these statements, making these statements, have total plausible deniability because it's so naive.
Yeah. I would want to look at a range of data, but I think my first inclination is to think those are probably conversational implicature. And then the kind of or that an implicature story is attractive there anyway. And then the kind of deniability would be more like, I don't mean to suggest that. And part of what makes me think that is that, or think that I don't mean to suggest that isn't necessary for the cases, or sorry, let me think about how to put this. Okay, good. So I like an implicature-like story, I think, for the cases that you have in mind. And then I think you can't do a straightforward denial with those cases, because it's like, well, why did you say the thing that you said in the first place about our dear leader, right? Whereas with the examples that I'm looking at, there's no, well, why did you say this in the first place if you didn't mean that, right? That kind of questioning of the initial kind of use of the speech act isn't on point.
I was just wondering whether those ways of avoiding censorship or subverting censorship would be interesting for your approach with the interpretive foothold.
Oh, the toehold.
Yeah, the toeholds,
yeah. I mean, the toehold class is huge. So I don't, so I like, I like that idea.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking, yeah.
But I don't feel yet like I have very much to say about toeholds. Like I kind of like the idea, but I don't have as much to say about those as about the smaller category. And then with the toeholds, I mean, I think it's easy to establish them, not just with assertive speech acts and implicatures, but with questions, all sorts of things. Thanks.
Right, so we have Sally.
Hi, yes, thanks, Eric. So I'm having some trouble getting a grip on the phenomenon. And it seems like there's a lot of cases where the issue is really about quantifier domain restriction. And there's a controversy, there's an uncertainty about whether there's an implicit quantifier restriction or not. And I would think that typically what people would recommend in those cases is you do kind of go back and do some scorekeeping in the conversational, updating conversational scores, see what the relevant contrasts are and such like that. And I guess so if somebody denies a possibility, but that doesn't make sense given the conversational score, then you call them on it. And if it does, it does. And I guess I'm just kind of at a loss of why we can't just use ordinary tools to deal with the problem.
Because you're thinking, is this what you're thinking? If most of the cases have to do with things that are represented in the scoreboard, then we should just be appealing to scoreboard tools and not to more. Yeah, good. So I guess I think
that's relevant to what you say. You need people with local knowledge. You need people to have a sense of what the score is in this particular conversation and what are the relevant contrasts and what is, and what is the focus of this as opposed to that. And you have to have, doing scoreboard work is really hard, but it's not, new. It's that's just part of what doing pragmatics is.
Yeah, good. So, like one other place to look would be metaphors and analogies can raise possibilities. And it's not really clear to me how the scoreboards are gonna help there.
So it's not the cases. So the domain restrictions, those might work, but these others won't?
I feel like, oh, interesting. Well, I think that the bringing in the machinery of clarifying quantifiers is something that like we're comfortable with, and it helps to say you don't have to do any of that. You can just deny the raised possibility to someone who who doesn't think there's anything mysterious about saying like, everyone already ate, right? Like we all think, yeah, that's a mysterious sentence. And someone who doesn't see any mystery in it can, you know, nevertheless be brought to see that that raises some possibilities that they could deny. So I feel like bringing in the machinery of scoreboards is in some cases just going to be more than is appropriate to ask of a bystander, or maybe like more than a bystander is willing to engage in. But then I think in addition to that, there are other phenomena where the scoreboard negotiation just doesn't seem helpful.
Oh, that's confusing. So you're not wondering what is it that makes a particular possibility deniable or not, but how would you go about denying or not denying in a conversation? Those seem really different questions. I always thought that we were saying, so, you know, if you say everyone has already eaten and someone comes up and says, well, there are people in Ethiopia who haven't eaten. And then you say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean everybody in the sense of everybody. I meant everybody relevant for this meal or whatever like that. You know, that's a way of doing, you know, making clear quantifier restrictions in a sort of easy, simple way that happens all the time, because
totally
you've got
agree.
some random person who's thinking about possibilities that you didn't intend. And so it's a plausible deniability. But there are other cases where it's genuinely ambiguous. You didn't think about it. You didn't have that in mind. It seems worth making clear, you know, whatever. But in all of these cases, it seems like the background phenomenon that as philosophers of language or linguists we have is, you know, negotiation over quantifier restriction and how plausible that is against a backdrop of the conversational score. Maybe we're talking past each other. I'm sorry.
No, I think you're just saying, if I have it right, I think you're saying, look, there are all these other tools that you could appeal to in lots of these cases, and some of them are already on the shelf. And I'm not, yeah, if I can soapbox one more time in this talk, it would be to say, like, there needs to be more yes and in this kind of work. Like, I completely agree. Here's another tool. I don't mean to be in competition with any other tools. I do think that it's more obvious to me, just speaking autobiographically, that denial of raised possibilities is going to help with metaphors that are kind of open-ended. Then thinking about scoreboards is going to help. But I don't mean to replace the scoreboard conceptual scheme. Does that help?
Yeah, good.
Right. I saw Jenny. Do you still have a question? Or
I'm not sure. I'd rather have you go to someone else while I decide.
Okay, Jason.
Just weighing in on the last exchange between Sally and Eric. I think I don't agree with Eric's response to Sally, because I would say there's a point where Rich Thomason is trying to talk about plausible deniability, and he calls it canceling an implicature. And that's just wrong. Plausible deniability is not canceling an implicature. Like, you ask you say to the officer, I really have to get on my way. And then the officer, are you trying to bribe me? No, I'm not trying to bribe you. That's not canceling an implicature. It's a different phenomenon. And if you give the scoreboard analysis a la Sally's suggestion, it's like that. You're saying, oh, it was never on the scoreboard. But that's not what's going on here. It's like Elizabeth Camp's analysis of, there are different analyses of what's going on. You could have two scoreboards, like in Elizabeth Camp's analysis of insinuation, where you have a private scoreboard and a public scoreboard. But it's not just, it was never on the scoreboard to begin with. So I disagree with your saying, okay, this is just scoreboard semantics. I think, the phenomenon you're talking about will require, if you are going to deal with it with the scoreboard semantics, you need to make like Camp's move with her account of insinuation and have a public scoreboard and a private scoreboard, say.
Jason, just to be clear on who you're disagreeing with, do you disagree with me? Because I took myself to be saying, sure, Sally, those tools are helpful in a lot of these cases. It's not obvious to me that they're helpful in all the cases. And I think you gave a great case where it's not helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm saying it's just like the single scoreboard. We don't want to go back to saying, like, the single scoreboard view would be like, you know, I never said it in the first place. You misunderstood me. Right. And that misstates the sneakiness here.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the example. That's great.
So, Jenny, do you want to follow up, or I don't see any other questions, so.
I can try. But okay, so I'm still trying to get a grip on the scope of the issue, because it feels like there are a huge range of issues of interpretation that can be called possibility raising and deniable possibility raising on your view. Is it right that any time where that, you know, there's more than one interpretation that somebody might come to, there's been a possibility raised that's deniable? I mean, because if we're also getting into metaphor interpretation, and, you know, I say Rush Limbaugh was a monster, and then somebody says, oh, do you mean he was green? He wasn't green, right? You know, it's like that, you know, so I mean, I haven't wanted to raise my hand yet because I wasn't quite sure how to formulate this, but I want to know, are there any, I guess here's a good way of asking, are there any issues of interpretation which can't be understood as plausible, deniable possibility raising?
You mean like, you say any issues of interpretation that can't be understood that way? Do you mean like, are there any interpretations that can't be understood as that, or?
Well, it feels like all the issues that I have understood as other things that I find very interesting in terms of, you know, in ways that interpretations might diverge, can be described as deniable possibility raising on your view. And I'm wondering if there are any issues, not instances of it, but any issues that don't fall of interpretation that don't fall into this, or is it meant to be a really capacious category that covers all of these interpretational issues?
I guess I would say it's meant to be capacious, but then if you came up with an interpretation that was not straightforwardly deniable with just not P, then it wouldn't count, right? So if you say, you know, she produced a series of sounds that closely resembled Home Sweet Home, then you can't just say she sang beautifully at the end of that.
Well, I mean, I think I could probably construct a context in which you could. Okay. But I guess also, I haven't thought of all the issues of interpretation as issues of possibility raising before.
Right.
And it's a kind of interesting shift to think of interpretation issues as issues of possibility raising. And so I'm just wondering, what makes it an issue of possibility raising rather than issue of interpretation? Why is that the right way to describe it?
Okay, I hope this helps. Like it's more unifying, right? So if so the thought is not to think of it as deniable. Think of something hermeneutic as deniable possibility raising as opposed to, let's say, unpacking a metaphor or something like that, right? So it's not in competition. It's to say, look, there's a common trait that a lot of interpretation has, that it is like straightforwardly deniable in this way. And I agree with you, like maybe you could come up with contexts with where it's okay to do straightforward denial with lots of implicatures, but it's like harder to do than with just scope ambiguity, right? Mm-hmm. So the hope is that even if there are like some leaks to the concept, so it doesn't cut neatly across the conversational implicature and not boundary or something like that, that it has a unifying force that enables us to see that a tactic that's useful in one place might be useful, or in one particular speech exchange might be useful in another. So if you had, distinct work on metaphor and conversational implicature and domain restriction and joking and sarcasm and, so on and so on and so forth, that wasn't looking to strategies for denial in other places, then this could be helpful. I think Gillian Russell had a really nice example the last time I gave this paper of people who are good at denying raised possibilities. And I loved her example. She thinks Cornel West is especially good at this, right? So think of the way that he often kind of does like a calling in, but of course we think that phi kind of thing in response to an interlocutor sometimes saying something that raises a possibility that not phi. That's, maybe this is idealized Cornel West, but if you're tracking his sensibility and ability here in the way that I am, that's a way of recognizing a certain sort of hanging together of all these different interpretive approaches and responding with the same kind of tactic to all of them. Does that help? Thanks for letting me try.